Support comes from Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to sustainable and sound conservation of the state's forests, which support more than 41,000 Missouri jobs, resulting in a $10 billion industry. ChooseWood.com.
This is St. Louis on the Air from St. Louis Public Radio. I'm Elaine Cha. 2024 is going to be a busy election year. In addition to a presidential contest, every statewide office in Missouri is going to be up for election, except one. That one is Missouri Auditor, a position currently held by Scott Fitzpatrick. The 36-year-old Republican has been in that role since January. He previously served as state treasurer, and before that, he represented a Southwest Missouri district in the House of Representatives. As state auditor, Fitzpatrick is responsible for rooting out fraud. He's the state's primary taxpayer watchdog. He recently joined St. Louis Public Radio's Politically Speaking podcast, where he talked with politics correspondent Jason Rosenbaum and state and politics reporter Sarah Kellogg. And for the rest of today's show, we're going to listen to part of that interview. To get started, Sarah asked him how his job as auditor differs from his time as treasurer and as a legislator.
In the legislature, you're obviously doing policy making. I specialized in the budget when I was in legislature, and a lot of people, people like the budget chairman for the most part, unless you tell them no, which I did a lot. But in the treasurer's office, everything that we did was very positive. It was very feel-good oriented. You're giving people their unclaimed property back. You're, creating the scholarship program for low-income students and kids with special needs to go to the school they want to go to, and you're, doing those types of things, giving out low-interest loans through the MoBucks program. The auditor's office, people generally don't like to see you coming, and so it's just a different, kind of a different demeanor in terms of how I think you're felt about, and by the people you're interacting with, and so that's probably the biggest difference is, you're not out there doing things that the people that you're talking to are loving to hear about all the time. But I think that the work is really important. And, we've already done a lot of, I think, impactful things in the less than a year that we've been there. And we have a lot that we're going to do in the years to come.
In your swearing in, you said that you were looking forward to working with the legislature. How much of that has actually happened this past session, and what is some of the work that you want to see accomplished?
So one of the biggest challenges that we've experienced coming into the office was the staffing levels in the office. And, staffing is a big issue that's consumed the private sector and the public sector for the last several years throughout the COVID pandemic. For whatever reason, there's just been a lot more demand for people to come to work than there are people who want to work. And in the auditor's office, we're no different. We're in a kind of a subset professionally that is struggling to attract young people. The accounting economy is not exactly a hotbed for young people looking to enter the workforce, and so we've been dealing with those challenges as well as the challenge of just being a government entity that doesn't have the ability to react to changes in the market compensation for employees as quickly as the private sector does. And so we have some budget constraints that have made it difficult to have the office staffed where it needs to be, and have had to focus on getting the office back into a position to being able to do audits other than just the bare minimum mandatory audits that we have to do every year.
In fact, we had actually discussed this topic when I inquired about a possible audit of the Children's Division.
Yeah.
You said to me that there were things that are happening at the Children's Division that warrant an audit, especially since I don't think that agency has ever been audited, but you can't just snap your fingers and do it because you have staffing constraints. I imagine that's not the only instance where that's happened.
True. It's not the only instance. And the thing is that when you engage in an audit, it's very different than like filing a lawsuit, right? I mean, you can whip together a petition, file a lawsuit, and say I filed a lawsuit. And an audit, when you commit to doing an audit, you're committing to a tremendous amount of staff time to actually go in and do work that is going to take several months to do, and will take in some cases upwards of a year to get done with and issue a report. And so that's a big decision when you're dealing with limited resources to decide, hey, where are we going to focus this limited amount of staff time that we have?
During your swearing in, you outlined two major goals. The first was looking at the spending of federal COVID dollars. How has the work on that been so far?
Well, as I kind of described, when we got in January and I began looking at what we call the audit plan, which is kind of the roadmap for the upcoming year of how we're going to spend our time and on what audits, the first thing that I realized was that we didn't have enough people to really do anything other than what we were required to do by law. We had maybe a couple thousand staff hours, which, is probably one audit worth of hours available to make a decision on what did we want to do from a discretionary standpoint on audits. So the COVID money has been part of what we call the single audit, which is a really boring term for the audit of all the federal funds that is done every year. We are just now getting into looking at some of the pandemic era food programs. There have been a lot of concerns around fraud and the meal programs for students and for adults that were, that money came to the state from the federal government. It was administered through the Department of Health and Senior Services, and there were a lot of nonprofit entities that got access to those funds in order to, provide meals. And so there's a lot of questions about, were meals actually provided in the amount that has been claimed, or was some of that money siphoned off and used inappropriately? And so that's probably the biggest pandemic era audit that is underway right now. That's not just a routine audit, and it's one that we're just now beginning, and we'll be working on into next year.
The other goal you mentioned would be upping the auditing of Missouri schools. How has that goal been worked on so far?
Well, it's another one of those goals that has been kind of set on the back burner until we get staff to a level where we can manage the mandatory audits and then have some time left over for discretionary. We did initiate the first, at least what I believe to be the first discretionary school audit that the auditor's office has done in a very, very long time. I don't think there was one done under Auditor Galloway that wasn't done as a result of a petition, but we're in the middle of the Francis Howell School District audit right now. There were a lot of issues raised about a bond issue for some construction projects at Francis Howell, where those projects were going over budget by almost double what their initial projected cost was. And so that was the basis for deciding, hey, that Francis Howell was going to be, the school district where we were going to direct our discretionary audit resources at. And that report is getting pretty close to being done, I think.
You launched an audit of the state's cannabis program. Why did you decide to do that?
Well, the marijuana programs together between the recreational and the medical programs make up some significant portion. I don't remember the statistic now, but it's they make up a third of the language in the entire Constitution now. That stat might be a little bit off, but they're easily rank up at the very top of the list of the most impactful or biggest kind of sea change policy decisions that have been made in the state in the last several years. And obviously it's created a new industry which is heavily regulated by the government that is servicing the entire population of the state. And there's been a lot of public interest in that program. And so we decided, and actually I was asked this during the campaign last year at the Missouri Press Association Candidate Forum, if I was going to do an audit of the marijuana program. And I said, yeah, I would intend to do that. It's a big program, and it's the subject of a lot of attention, both publicly and in the legislature. The legislative interest has died off a little bit, but there for a couple of years, it was definitely a big subject of conversation in the legislature and looking into the decision-making process of setting up the program and how certain decisions were made, such as the number of licenses that were going to be handed out. So we're doing that audit. It's a performance audit. It's one of a handful of those that we're in the process of working on now, and I would expect that will come out sometime next year.
It's no secret that there's a lot of money and political pressure associated with this industry, but do you think that it is much different from other industries that depend on the state for license purposes?
Well, I do, just in the fact that it's, most other regulated industries that, where you have a profession that's licensed by the state, it's if you meet a certain set of qualifications, you can get a license. This is, the only one that I can think of where you can meet a set of qualifications and not get a license because there's not enough licenses available to give you. And that was an administrative decision, and it's one that we're looking at as part of the audit and determining what was the criteria for making that decision. And it may be the case that the department has a great answer for that, and and has a defensible position on it. And if that's the case, then great. But that's the big difference that I think drives kind of the disparity between this type of regulated industry versus any other type of regulated industry that the state has a oversight role in.
That's Missouri Auditor Scott Fitzpatrick talking with STLPR Sarah Kellogg and Jason Rosenbaum on a recent episode of the Politically Speaking podcast. More of that conversation in just a moment. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio. Let's return to our conversation with Missouri Auditor Scott Fitzpatrick. He was a recent guest on STLPR's Politically Speaking podcast with Sarah Kellogg and Jason Rosenbaum. They discussed a recent high-profile dispute Fitzpatrick had with fellow Republican statewide official, Attorney General Andrew Bailey. Fitzpatrick's office is responsible for what's known as fiscal notes. Those are estimations on how much money a ballot initiative would either cost or save state or local governments. And after his office estimated that a slew of proposals that would legalize abortion would have little financial impact on governments at state or local levels, Bailey refused to sign off on the fiscal note, contending they would actually cost the state billions of dollars. Fitzpatrick rejected Bailey's arguments, and ultimately the case ended up in the state's judicial branch. The Missouri Supreme Court sided with Fitzpatrick, ruling that the Attorney General's office had no authority to provide a de facto veto over a state auditor's fiscal notes. Sarah Kellogg asked Fitzpatrick about his process to determine the fiscal note.
Well, it's the same process that has been used on every other initiative petition in the last 25 years that the auditor's office has been in charge of the fiscal note process. And that process really involves, we get, number one, we have a very condensed time frame to do this work. And there's a period of time, and these initiative petitions fell in the period of time where we have a tremendous number of these coming into our office at any given time. And we have 20 days from start to finish, and the first 10 days of that is reserved for people to submit any material they want us to consider in writing the fiscal note, and then the second 10 days is designated for us to analyze that information and actually write the fiscal note and fiscal note summary. And when you have, in this case, what was there, 11 initiative petitions just related to abortion that came in at once, all with subtle differences. But there were also other initiative petitions that had nothing to do with abortion that were in the process at that time as well. And so when you look at all of that, we have a very small amount of time to try to make a decision, analyze the information, make a decision on this. So the process that we went through is we put it out, sent it out to all the state agencies and a handful of local governments, around 60 local government entities, or maybe 60 altogether entities that we sent it out to comment for, including school districts, including city, county governments, and say, what's the impact of this petition, initiative petition, if it were to pass, on your political subdivision? And by the way, we also take any submission, even if we didn't specifically request it, we would take a submission from any other government entity that wanted to provide one, or from a proponent or opponent of the initiative that wanted to submit them. And we consider all of those in the process of drafting the fiscal note summary. So we did that, and the overwhelming response, other than a response from Greene County, was that this initiative petition, which would legalize abortion is not going to have a net change. It's not going to cause a net change to state costs or state revenues, right? So, we looked at that and we said, this is all pretty reasonable. We printed it. We even printed the one from Greene County that said they were going to lose some property tax revenue because of fewer citizens as a result of abortion. We sent that to the Attorney General, and then the job from there is the Attorney General has to approve the legal content and form, which is historically meant, does it have 50 words or less, excluding articles, and does it use any outrageous language? And in the history of the 25 years leading up to now, that had always been a perfunctory sign off. There'd never been a fiscal note rejected by the Attorney General's office. But that's the process that we used in this fiscal note, just as we have in every other one that came before it and after it.
So what did you make of the fact that Attorney General Andrew Bailey would not sign off on the fiscal note?
Well, I mean, we it's all pretty public at this point, and it was that, we didn't think that they had the authority to reject it based on the fact that they didn't like the numbers. And, so we just said, listen, if there's a cogent legal argument to be made that we are actually, because the issue was that they wanted us, in their opinion, rejecting the fiscal note. They said, well, we think you're going to lose 100% we would lose as a state 100% of our federal Medicaid money, because this being legalized would put us in violation of federal abortion law. And we just said, well, we don't see that, and if you can provide like a legal argument that's like, shows the rationale for that, then we could consider changing the fiscal note. We never received that. And ultimately there was a stalemate because we said we're not going to change it. As much as I dislike abortion and want these initiatives to fail, I can't let that play into the decision I'm making about how we present the fiscal impact of an initiative petition to voters. And so we said we're not going to change it unless we get like a legitimate analysis here that says that our initial fiscal note was wrong. Which, by the way, the Attorney General's office had they were one of the entities we requested a statement from in the initial drafting of the fiscal note. And their response was that it would have no impact other than if it resulted in increased litigation, they may have to request some additional resources for their office. But there was no analysis at that point provided that there was an issue relating to Medicaid funding. So we didn't change it. They didn't sign off on it. It was a stalemate. The petitioner sued everybody, sued us, sued the Attorney General, and sued the Secretary of State, saying that one of these people didn't do their job, and we are owed this certified, summary statement so we can circulate these initiative petitions for signatures. And then it became a situation where the courts had to kind of weigh everything out and figure out who did what right and who did what wrong.
Do you think that this was a larger issue than just about how to describe the abortion costs? It was really about like your authority to be the ultimate arbiter of fiscal notes and not the Attorney General getting like a de facto veto?
Yeah, I think that was a big part. I mean, obviously that had the outcome of the case would have had, if it had gone differently, would have radically changed the way these things would be done moving forward. And if the Attorney General's office did, in fact, have essentially veto authority over the auditor's fiscal note estimates, that would, I think, render the statute unconstitutional, because in that way you end up in a situation where the auditor and the Attorney General could go round and round and round 50 times. And that process could take an unlimited amount of time in a situation where you could have a petitioner that never received a certified ballot summary. So in that case, it was important, because had we lost the lawsuit, or had we caved to the pressure to change it, it would have set a terrible precedent moving forward that any time there's a politically difficult issue that the Attorney General doesn't agree with the auditor on, that they could try to trump the auditor on the fiscal impact.
Or if there's a Democratic Attorney General and a Republican auditor, and there's like there's an amendment to ban abortion or something,
yeah,
and the Attorney General said this is going to cost $10 quadrillion.
Sure.
Like it seems like it could actually backfire on Republicans in the long run.
Well, when Schmidt was the Attorney General and Galloway was the auditor, there was the referendum on HB 126, which never actually made the ballot, but there was going to be a referendum and Galloway actually wrote a fiscal note that said that bill, if it were to stay in effect, could cost the state its entire Medicaid, budget, at that time, which was like $7 billion. It was significantly less than it is now. And Schmidt, it was submitted to Schmidt. Schmidt certified it. And I actually think we know obviously that fiscal note was wrong, right? I mean, we know that HB 126 has been in law since 2019, or what I guess when it fully went into effect when
2022.
Yeah, when Roe. But the state has not received a threat, as far as we're aware, of any loss of federal Medicaid funding because of that bill being enacted. And if there was ever going to be a case where the Attorney General and the auditor disagreed, you would think that would be the one where Schmidt would have tried to say, hey, Galloway, we think your fiscal note's wrong here. But that didn't happen, So clearly, in their estimation, if they were even thinking about it, that was not something that they had the power to do.
I think that there's a perception, especially among proponents of abortion rights, that this fiscal note standoff, as well as the fights over the ballot summary language, it's really just delay tactics to prevent these initiatives from even having a chance to get on the ballot. What do you think of that perception? Because, frankly, some Republicans like Senator Andrew Koenig have said they want these delay tactics to happen because they don't want anything on the ballot.
Well, I don't want anything on the ballot either. And to that, I think that's totally what happened. Obviously, the court has said that they can circulate these things for signature without a certified summary statement. I think they are doing well. I think they maybe began doing some of that.
This is where it gets confusing. There are two groups trying to roll back the abortion ban. The one that we were talking about have not decided on an initiative yet. The other one that we're talking about is circulating a petition, but they're suing over the fiscal note and the ballot summary right now. But continue.
But no, I think that the byproduct being a delay in the certification of the summary statement or the ballot summary is certainly one that everybody that doesn't want the initiative petition to pass has considered. You know what I mean? And I don't want it to pass either. That being said, I also realize that I have a statutory obligation and a constitutional responsibility to do the job as it's been assigned to me by the Constitution and by the statutes that give me the authority to write the fiscal notes. And I was just trying to do that job, and my goal was to do that and do it right, and then fight against these initiatives on the back end. Right? I didn't find it appropriate for us to use this process of drafting the ballot summary to try to derail initiative petitions, because that wouldn't be right if it was happening in the other direction, right? If you had a bunch of Democrats in charge of the statewide offices and Republicans were trying to get something on the ballot, I'd be pretty pissed off if that's what they were doing to us. I just try to look at it that way too.
Moving to the 2024 election, how do you think the dynamics of the legislature will change since it is an election year and people are running for other offices?
Well, it's going to be hard for it to get much worse, in terms of just like the dynamic in the legislature, particularly in the Senate, right? I don't think I'm saying anything that all the senators themselves wouldn't agree with. It's a tough environment over there to get anything done, and it's only going to be made more difficult, in my estimation, by the fact that you have several of them that are going to be running for higher office, and in an era where paid media is pretty expensive and fundraising is hard, earned media is, if you're a state senator, is pretty easy to generate. And so I expect that you see some of them using that platform that they have in the Senate to get their name in the in the press some. And when that happens, it's likely to be, the byproduct of that is likely to be a gridlocked legislative session. That being said, I don't want to write the whole thing off. I think the leadership, wants to get things done. I think that the combination of Cindy O'Loughlin and Caleb Rowden in the Senate I think they're good leaders and have the ability to, find common ground if there's any to be found. But it's going to be a tough year, I think, legislatively, and I hope I'm wrong. I hope we can get some good stuff done. On the other hand, it also can stop some bad stuff from happening when you have legislature doesn't pass a lot of bills. So you never know what you're gonna You never know what you're going to end up with, but I do think it's going to complicate things a little bit.
We're looking at Republican primaries for most of the statewide positions in 2024, Secretary of State, governor and lieutenant governor, and even treasurer, even though there currently is a Republican serving in that position. What do you make of all these primaries?
Well, it's not unusual. I mean, anytime you have, I think 2020 was a little bit of an anomaly when you had, you had Kehoe and Schmidt and myself. All three of us were on the ballot, and all three of us ran pretty much unopposed.
Kind of. Kehoe did have to face off against Mike Carter, who rebounded in 2020 and ran an excellent state Senate race, but continue.
Right. And so, I mean, we got out and didn't have a lot of, other than that, didn't have opposition in the primary. I think it was a function of a few things. I think one, I think that the Senate didn't have as many people leaving. We're in a situation now where there are a lot of people term limited that are talented and have ambitions to, go to the statewide level. And you didn't have as much of that going on in 2020. And so I think that's part of it. But I just think that generally speaking, Republicans in Missouri, we have primaries. It's, usually we have crowded primaries much more so than the Democrats do. And I don't think that that's going to change as long as we have such a dominant kind of position statewide with the electorate as being really difficult to beat in a statewide general election. I mean, it's the Democrats, obviously it's in a lot of these races, the statewide, whoever gets put up on a statewide ticket, it's like they're like sacrificing themselves, you know what I mean? And so that's just the reality of the situation. I think as long as the dynamic is like that in the state, you're going to continue to see crowded primaries.
Yeah, in a similar vein, how do you believe Missouri Republicans will fare in the 2024 elections?
Oh, I mean, unless we have an Aiken moment, I mean, I think it'll be a clean sweep again. I don't think that there's much of a chance at any level for the Democrat to prevail statewide right now. Generally speaking, I think, the Republican positions, especially outstate, are what people gravitate towards. And the Democrat Party has really kind of gravitated, in my view, towards, has gotten a lot more radical. And I think you can say there's an element of the Republican Party that's gotten radical as well. But generally speaking, it's not quite as mainstream.
You mentioned the different factions of the parties. Do you feel like having a splintered Republican, I said there's always primaries with Republicans, having that many people run for a position versus having kind of one person on the Democrats to kind of go behind. Do you think that puts Republicans at a disadvantage or not?
Well, yeah, anytime you have a tough primary where you have candidates spending, they're raising money and if they have to spend it all in a primary, that puts them at a less advantageous position in the general. But I don't think it's enough to matter, you know what I mean, in terms of the outcome of the general election. Unless, like I said, unless we have a really bad candidate, on the Republican side that prevails in a primary, which we have had happen. We have had that happen before. And, so as long as that doesn't happen, I think we'll be fine.
That's Missouri Auditor Scott Fitzpatrick talking with STLPR State House and Politics reporter Sarah Kellogg and politics correspondent Jason Rosenbaum on a recent episode of the Politically Speaking podcast.
This episode was produced by Sarah Kellogg and Jason Rosenbaum, with editing by our executive producer, Alex Hoyer. Podcast design by Aaron Dorr.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
St. Louis on the Air proudly supports local artists by using music from Life Creative Group.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations. And leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thanks.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to conservation and careful management of the state's forests to make them more resilient and better habitats for wildlife. ChooseWood.com.